Hello and a very warm welcome to another edition of World Panorama. Like always, we get ready to catch up on the biggest international news of the week. I'm Sana Khan. Now, before we get to those detailed reports, here's a look at the top stories this week. Violence rages on in deeply divided Egypt. World Panorama takes a closer look at the political instability and whether democracy will always be a dream. Tensions high and expectations are low. Israeli and Palestinian negotiators kick off their first substantive round of peace talks in nearly 5 years. A shocking tragedy and a big blow to the Indian Navy. INS Sindhu Rakshak explodes and sinks with 18 sailors on board. And just 40 days on from Wimbledon, French tennis sensation and reigning champion Marion Bartoli announces retirement. Straight to the top story. Hosni Mubarak may have been ousted in the year 2011, but many of the elements of his deep state remained in place. Egypt's Islamists called for a Friday of anger in Cairo after nearly 600 people were killed following a crackdown on their protest camps. The call raised fears of fresh violence. Political uncertainty heightened amid silence from Egypt's government. Now, neither Egypt's military nor the civilian leaders it appointed last month as the country's interim government gave any statements explaining a strategy for guiding Egypt from its political quagmire. Now, the crackdown followed 6 weeks of attempts by Western diplomats to broker a political resolution that might persuade the Islamists to abandon their protests and rejoin a renewed democratic process despite the military's removal of Morsi. But the brutality of this attack seemed to extinguish any such hopes. US President Barack Obama led the international outrage at the bloody crackdown, announcing the cancellation of a joint US-Egyptian military exercise. The US policy so far had been convoluted. It wasn't calling it a coup, and it wasn't not calling it a coup. Clearly, there's more at stake in Egypt than merely the shape of the next government or even the issue of Morsi's reinstatement. Now, what is the fate of Egypt? Joining me on the show this week to shed light on our top story is Dr. Wael Awwad, senior journalist. Thank you so much, Dr. Awwad, for joining me on the show. Before that, here's a look at this report.
After the bloodiest day since its Arab Spring began, Egypt now faces a new phase of uncertainty. The death toll from political violence has left more than 600 people dead. The nationwide violence erupted on Wednesday after security forces broke up Cairo protest camps set up by supporters of deposed President Mohamed Morsi.
الدم ده واحد واقف جنبي في ثانية انضرب بالترام على صدري مات.
مفيش مشي تاني.
مات في ثانية. طلع جيله في صدره. عملنا ايه؟
إلقاء غاز يشوي الوجوه، محرم دولية من أعلى كوبري 6 أكتوبر على الناس السلميين اللي بيقولوا علينا إرهاب. الإرهاب هو الانقلاب، إحنا مش إرهاب.
Violence rippled out from Cairo with Morsi supporters and security forces clashing in the cities of Alexandria, Minya, Asyut, Fayoum and Suez, and Buhaira and Beni Suef provinces. Lasting stability for Egypt appeared further away than ever, as the military declared a month-long state of emergency and the liberal Mohammed al-Baradei resigned as vice president in the military-backed interim government.
لكن طبعا لما تدخلنا طلبنا ضرورة ضبط النفس لأقصى درجة. والحقيقة الشرطة وأنا بنتهز هذه الفرصة لكي أتقدم بخالص الشكر للشرطة لأنها تحملت هذا الجهد الكبير بأعلى درجة من درجات ضبط النفس. طلبوا قبل ما يخرجوا يجي جماعات حقوق الإنسان يشرفوا. كل شيء كان في العلن، في تصوير، وتبين إنه في أسلحة، في ذخائر، في أمور لا تنطق.
The crackdown defied Western appeals for restraint and a peaceful negotiated settlement to Egypt's political crisis, following the military's removal of Islamist President Mohamed Morsi last month, prompting international statements of dismay and condemnation.
The United States strongly condemns today's violence and bloodshed across Egypt. It's a serious blow to reconciliation and the Egyptian people's hopes for a transition towards democracy and inclusion.
The Secretary General condemns in the strongest terms the violence today in Cairo, that occurred when Egyptian security services used force to clear Cairo of sit-ins and demonstrations.
The turmoil was the last chapter in a bitter standoff between Morsi's supporters and the interim leadership that took over the Arab world's most populous country. It also effectively ends the open political role of the Brotherhood, with the harshest ever crackdown on a movement that survived underground for 85 years to emerge after the 2011 uprising and win every election held since.
All right, let me go across to Dr. Awwad now. Dr. Awwad, more violence expected on the streets of Cairo. The death toll has crossed over 600, and a few days later we saw more violent clashes. The situation definitely doesn't look good.
Definitely it's not good at all, because we were anticipating these things to happen. What happened was that when the army took over, and they have already given them more than 40 days to the Muslim Brotherhood to disperse and remove all the barricades they have created in Rabaa al-Adawiyya or the Midan or wherever they are, near to the mosque, where they have tried to get their supporters and to demonstrate their defiance of the government decisions. So there was an anticipation, and the army given the ultimatum, and they have already told them this is declared an emergency and people have to be dispersed. But there were also reports from within the camps where these people were already camping that side, that they have been retained and detained, not allowing the Muslim Brotherhood leadership were not allowing them to move out. So there are now claim and counter-claim reports for who started the fire. If you can see, we are only reporting of 645 people died, or so maybe another 100, but there are reports give the number more than this.
Absolutely.
And also there are more than 50 policemen, including top rank officers who were killed. Then who killed these officers if it was a peaceful demonstration? There were cars thrown out from the bridges. There were napalm bombs thrown on the army and on the police. And there were perpetrators within the demonstrators who were firing, and they were trained militants who have been shooting at the army.
Violence was indeed from both these sides, but many also believe that the violent crackdown on the 14th was intended to provoke the Muslim Brotherhood. What do you feel really happened? Why are such statements coming out then?
I think it's in the contrary. Look, I mean, it's unfortunate, the loss of blood, and we were also apprehensive that this is going to happen in Egypt. It's everybody's concerned, because Egypt should not go the same way Syria is going now. It should be retained, and people should use their wisdom to avoid the bloodshed in the street. What happened was that these people refused the order of the army, refused the order of the interim government. Right. And they were defiant from day one. They said, we do not, no dialogue, no talk to the interim government. This is illegal. The coup is illegal. So we needed to install Mr. Morsi. So the people of the Muslim Brotherhood from day one refused. So what else you can do it for an installment that it took more than 40 days? You need to forcibly removing the people out of their barricades, so at least the normalcy can come. Because the army also have said that we are giving 3 months period, then we will prepare for the constitution and a free election. So if you wanted the sympathy waves to stay with you, you could easily move out and let the people say, yes, you have been a victim of a sinister regime who is trying to dispose the president, elected president. So that would have been, the sympathy wave would have been in their favor. But to say that, confront the army, definitely the army have the upper hand at the moment, and there will be more bloodshed.
So the movement has taken a whole new turn. Now, at the time of the coup, the new leaders had promised a steady government, a new constitution, a transition, so to speak. Now, with this incident that we've seen, so much violence and more expected, where does that leave the transition that was so much being looked forward to?
I think the army still contain the violence in the street. I mean, if you watch the normal channels, you will not see that much of violence as you watch some of the channel, which is really inciting the people, giving more in the front the children and lead women and elderly to get them killed. And then you say, okay, there is a sympathy waves on the street, and then there is a humanitarian intervention, and the world will bring down the army for taking over. But I think in general, there is a bloodshed, yes, there is a violence in the street, but the army still have the upper hand, and if they are able to control, then we don't think this is going to be spill over all over Egypt. But I also would like to mention here, polarization of the society started by the Muslim Brotherhood continued. If you are against the army and the police, then why are you burning the churches? More than 16 churches were burned.
That's right.
So how do you justify attacking a minorities, giving the impression that those are mobs, are fanatics, are not willing to have People live together in a homogeneous society, in a multi-ethnic. So what do you expect the reaction would be, the international reaction? Whoever started the fire, it's a condemnable. You should not destroy the property of anybody, neither the government property nor the property of any other minorities, because that is the wrong impression you will give, and that's what will be a rejection more of the Muslim Brotherhood in the street of Egypt.
Right.
And that's what the army is trying for.
Talking about the international reaction, we've seen leaders of all the major countries coming out and condemning the recent violence that we've seen. On Thursday, Barack Obama cancelled a joint military exercise, but he has not touched that annual aid that the US gives to Egypt. How do you see the West looking at what's happening in Egypt now, and what's going to be their next move?
I think the West understood, and they have already played the game plan. They have really, the American dragged the army into a confrontation on the street against the Muslim Brotherhood, who have been already, we have talked earlier, they have been armed themselves and they are ready for the fight. So there is a militant wing within the Muslim Brotherhood who will take on the army. There will be more bloodshed if this is really spelled in the street of Egypt. Therefore, the West understood the game plan. And the army of Egypt is a very respectable army, by the way. It has been in power. It has been the shadow government, like any other military strong government. But they don't want to take the mess at the moment. There is inflation, there is unemployment, there are poverty, there are lots of challenges. So they put Egypt at a dangerous crossroad right now, which will be difficult for the international community to deny human rights. But also, we should also not forget what a Britisher, once a leader, said: when it comes to national security, to hell with the human rights. So everybody take his national interest first, and then talk of the other democracy or human rights issue where they are trying to raise. If you wanted no humanitarian crisis in Egypt or in the Arab world, you wouldn't have supported the Muslim Brotherhood organization, who are now hijacking the aspiration of the Arab street for a true democracy, for a true freedom of speech and a better future. It is not the alternative that we are looking for. I wanted my children to be in a much better society, much better place where they can live together, coexist with other minorities group in the city, not to sideline, and I just show one color. There is no one color in the Arab world. It is a secular, and it has to remain that way.
That's right, and what we're seeing right now is a divided Egypt that has lurched from one crisis to another ever since the downfall of autocratic Hosni Mubarak back in 2011. We've touched upon a lot of broad points over here, and for that, thank you so much, Dr. Awwad, for joining me on World Panorama this week. All right, with that, we're taking a very short break. Lots more up ahead. We'll be taking a closer look at the Israel and Palestinian peace talks. Don't go anywhere. You're watching World Panorama. Israelis and Palestinians launched formal talks on terms of a Palestinian state ending a 5-year freeze. The talks were overshadowed by recent Israeli announcements on promoting plans for more than 3,000 new settlement apartments. The current round of negotiations is the third attempt since 2000 to set up a Palestinian state alongside Israel. Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas has embarked on an unpopular course, returning to talks with Israel in search of a peace agreement and statehood. A second US-sponsored meeting took place in Jerusalem on Wednesday.
لأننا على قناعة بأن المفاوضات السياسية والعمل الدبلوماسي هي الطريق الأنجح لتحقيق السلام في منطقتنا. وها أنا ذا يا سيادة الأمين العام أفي اليوم لقد بدأت المفاوضات أمس وآمل أن تكلل بالنجاح.
The meeting began hours after Israel freed 26 Palestinian prisoners as part of the deal to restart the stalled negotiations. On Thursday, Abbas welcomed UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon in his first visit to Palestine, following the UN General Assembly's recognition of it as a non-member observer state.
I remain deeply troubled by Israel's continuing settlement activity in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. Settlement activity is deepening the Palestinian people's mistrust in the seriousness on the Israeli side towards achieving a peace. It will ultimately render a two-state solution impossible.
Optimism was in short supply before the two sides' first official meeting in Jerusalem. A handout video showed Israeli negotiators Zipi Livni and Yitzhak Molko shaking hands with their Palestinian counterpart Saib Erekat. However, in an attempt to avoid any public wrangling in the talks, officials have said few details would be released.
This conflict may never end. If it ends in a politically divided Jerusalem. There is no other way.
The city, 125 kilometers large, remains deeply divided with little room for a border to separate the two entities.
Unless it will be possible to draw a line on the map, a border that will carve out a viable, contiguous Palestinian city in East Jerusalem that will be part of the West Bank, there will be no two-state solution.
The aim of the talks is to negotiate an end to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict based on the so-called two-state solution, a Palestinian state existing alongside Israel. Although the agenda has not been publicized, UN Secretary of State John Kerry has previously said that all final status issues, Jerusalem, borders, security arrangements, settlements and Palestinian refugees are on the table. Although no time frame for these talks has been set, the US has said that final status negotiations will be held for 9 months. And the Indian Navy suffered a huge blow on Wednesday when a frontline submarine exploded and sank at the Mumbai dockyard with 18 sailors after 2 explosions turned it into a deadly ball of fire. Already facing a depleting strength of underwater vessels, the loss of one of its youngest and most capable submarines, the INS Sindhu Rakshak, is a big setback for the Navy.
In a major setback to the Indian Navy, submarine INS Sindhu Rakshak caught fire after a massive explosion and sank in the Mumbai dockyard. None of the 18 sailors aboard the submarine survived.
Great loss to all of us. Latest tragedy in the recent time. I feel sad about that. I feel sad about also those Navy personnel who lost their lives in the service of the country.
Amateur video footage showed a fireball in the forward section of the Sindhu Rakshak, where torpedoes and missiles are stored as well as the battery units. At least 16 fire tenders at the Mumbai Fire Brigade and Mumbai Port Trust were at the spot, with nearly 180 fire personnel fighting the fire. Though the exact cause of the fire is yet to be ascertained, one thing is certain, that the disaster has most certainly left a dent in the country's defences.
Now the basic question is what caused the fire and the explosions. We do not have an answer to that question as of now. On any warship, and it is more pronounced on a submarine, there are several ingredients that can contribute to or cause a fire.
Navy has already ordered a board of inquiry. Board will go into all details about the incident.
The accident comes in the same week as India launched a locally built aircraft carrier due for completion in 2017 and announced that the reactor on its first home-built nuclear submarine was now operational.
So while the Sindhu Rakshak is an accident that would have to be investigated, and I do concede that it takes some of the sheen away, because over the last few days, as I said, there was a lot of satisfaction and pride in the country that though these were modest steps, launching an aircraft carrier is a big deal for a country that till 10 years ago was not even making a scooter, forget about a car. So in that sense, it was a reflection of India's techno-industrial competence.
The Indian Navy has now a fleet of 14 submarines, including 9 Russian Kilo-class submarines, 4 German HDWs and 1 nuclear submarine INS Chak released to it by Russia last year. The Sindhu Rakshak submarine was set to sail for its new mission in the next few days and was fully armed with its torpedoes and anti-ship missiles in the naval dockyards in Mumbai at the time of the incident.
And much else has been unfolding around the world. Here's a quick wrap of the other global news of the week.
The German Chancellor Angela Merkel has launched her re-election campaign by implying she's a safe pair of hands steering the economy. Merkel addressed about 1,000 people in a town near Frankfurt. News that the German economy grew by 0.7% in the second quarter boosted her campaign for a third term in power. Her conservative Christian Democrats and her Bavarian allies have a big lead in opinion polls. The election will be held on 22nd September, and Merkel's campaign tour will take her to nearly 60 events before then. Ibrahim Keita won Mali's presidential election runoff with 77.61% of the vote, handing him a strong mandate for sweeping reforms in the war-torn West African state. Keita, Prime Minister from 1994 to 2000, stood for President in 2002 and 2007. This time he won 78% of the vote. The election is intended to restore normality after a coup and French-led military action against the Islamists and Tuareg rebels. Japan marked 68 years since the end of World War II on August 15th with a secular ceremony attended by the Emperor Akihito and Empress Michiko at the Nippon Budokan Hall in Tokyo. Nearly 5,000 people, including government officials and people who lost loved ones in the war, attended the ceremony and took part in a moment of silence. United Nations experts will travel to Syria eminently to investigate claims of chemical weapons use during that country's civil war after the UN and the Syrian government agreed on details of the trip. The UN inquiry will only try to establish whether chemical weapons were used, not who used them. Lebanon was holding a day of mourning on Friday after a car bomb killed at least 22 people in Beirut, stronghold of Shiite group Hezbollah which backed Syrian's embattled president. The attack was carried out in the densely populated southern suburbs of Beirut. Police said the death toll had climbed to at least 22, while the Red Cross said 325 people were wounded. A huge flood struck the northeastern province of China on Thursday, when water level rose up in the Heilongjiang River due to frequent rains. The increasing water level opened the floodgates of the water reservoir in the upper reaches of the river. The flood caused huge loss to local residents. A total of 1,886 hectares of farmland, which is planted with corn, rice and beans in the village, has been submerged in water, and local farmers are facing total crop failure.
Shifting gears, time to bring you up to speed with all the sports news that you might have missed this week. Here's all the sports action.
Reclaiming the 100-meter World Championship gold he lost through a false start in South Korea 2 years ago, the Olympic champion once again holds every major sprint title there is. Despite getting late out of the blocks in the downpour, the Jamaican superstar steadily caught up with 2004 Olympic champion Justin Gatlin and left the American behind with a trademark late burst of speed that still no one can match. Though Bolt recreated this victory by claiming the gold in 9.77 seconds, it took him several minutes of understated celebrations before he unleashed the mighty lightning bolt pose that made him famous across the globe. Wimbledon champion Marion Bartoli shocked the tennis world by announcing her retirement from the sport at the age of 28. Her surprise announcement comes just 6 weeks after she beat Germany's Sabine Lisicki in the Wimbledon final to claim her one and only Grand Slam title. Bartoli had given no hint that she was considering retirement and in fact seemed focused on preparing for the North American hardcourt season and upcoming US Open. Metalist Kharkiv, due to play Schalke 04 in the Champions League playoff around next week, have been kicked out of the competition over a domestic match-fixing case dating back to 2008. The decision by UEFA's appeal committee came 10 days after Metalist lost an appeal at the Court of Arbitration for Sport. Metalist said they would appeal to the CAS. Olympics chief Alexander Zhukov said Russia would be able to guarantee that there would be no discrimination against gays in the Winter Games in Sochi. In June of this year, Russia passed a controversial anti-gay propaganda law. Critics of the law said it effectively disallows all gay rights rallies and could be used to prosecute anyone voicing support for homosexuals. President Vladimir Putin also banned same-sex couples from adopting children. The World Championship finally caught fire on Tuesday as the fans turned up to say farewell to Yelena Isinbayeva, only for the Russian pole vault queen to roll back the ears and win an emotional gold medal against all the odds. Without a global title since 2008, struggling for form and due to retire after this event, the 31-year-old fed off the energy produced by a finally near full and Raker's Luzhniki Stadium to triumph with a leap of 4.89 meters. She also hinted her much-discussed retirement might be brief.
That's all we have for you in this edition of World Panorama. See you next week, same time, with more international news. Till then, you can follow us on Facebook and Twitter. This week, I close the show with some tango. Enjoy these visuals of the famed Argentine tango group Sexteto Mea as they open the annual celebration and tango competition in Buenos Aires in front of a large crowd of tango enthusiasts and artists. This is me, Sana Khan, signing off.